Thank you, Heather. Welcome, everybody. I'm so pleased that you are able to join us today for the webinar. Our two speakers are Wayne Pennington, who is the Interim Dean at the College of Engineering at Michigan Technical University, and Chris Keene, who wears many hats at AGI and is also the Workforce Department's director. So with that, Wayne and Chris, take it away.
Okay, yes, this is Chris Keene. What I want to do is start off real quickly with a brief history of how we came to this conversation. I'm sure many of you remember somewhere in the last between 5 and 10 years ago, there were a number of surveys that circulated within the community relative to the interest about quote-unquote accreditation of geoscience programs. Most of this was in response, obviously, at that time, many geo programs were under threat. And some of the surveys were good quality, some were not so good, maybe leading, maybe a little misleading as well. Regardless, it created a lot of discussion, and during one of the last major surveys about 5 years ago, that was conducted, I guess, you could say through the auspices of GSA, the results were sufficient, and the conversations were sufficient that GSA had asked AGI to sort of take on the next steps of this process. And what we basically said to GSA and the other member societies of AGI was, we needed to see that there was sufficient community interest since it was a very polarizing issue. And we actually did have 10 of our member societies approach us formally and requested that an intersociety committee be formed to evaluate the general issues of accreditation in a very, very broad term. And so AGI did. We did form the committee. We sent an invite out to all 50 of our member societies, and 15, pretty much the 15 largest, most active societies, all put members on the committee. And from that point, we've been virtually meeting for about the last 2 years, sort of wrapping up our process. Wayne Pennington has been our chair as well as past AGI president. Next slide, please. So just real briefly, a few of the drivers, and Wayne, if you want to jump in, that's great too, that we sort of found that have led on to the conversation is the first thing is that not all geoscience and geoscience programs are made equal, not necessarily maybe in quality, but also in content and scope. They're all very unique. We have 650 undergraduate degree granting programs in the United States. That's almost triple the number of physics programs and is magnitudinally the same as the number of chemistry and physics programs that are, chemistry and biology programs that are out there that award bachelor's degrees. So it's a very diverse population of programs. And so this has been, I think one of the big questions, because one of the key feedbacks we've found is employers have said it's been difficult to assess what the background of graduates from a specific program, what they really have. And you certainly hear plenty of departments talk about employers. They sort of go back to the same departments, usually alma mater of employees and managers, because they happen to know and understand that program. Doesn't necessarily mean the ones that they're not going to wouldn't be valuable, but they just don't know. They don't have a way to assess it independently. And likewise, we've certainly seen plenty of feedback where the students themselves are not sure what their program genuinely prepares them for outside, maybe graduate school preparatory, maybe some very, very traditional degrees of, career trajectories, if that's how it's promoted in oil, gas, or mining, or what have you. But even then, many programs that are good, solid general geology programs, the students aren't sure. Can I go into the mining industry? Can I do environmental, things like that? And so, again, an issue of clarification for them. And again, one of the big precipitating points of those surveys before was, this worrying about survival. Right now, generally, most geo programs are thriving quite well. But again, the idea of some kind of external certification or mark was viewed by some quarters as a way to help build a defense against attacks on closing departments. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Wayne Pennington, who is past AGI president and also chair of this committee, and comes with substantial experience in the whole accreditation area from his programs. Wayne.
Okay, thank you, Chris, and thank you everybody for joining us here today. So the first thing we're going to look at is what is it we're talking about? Accreditation, classification, what do we mean here? So let's take a look at what accreditation is. There are a number of programs that are accredited through, let me back up a bit here first. Of course, your universities are accredited, and this sometimes causes some confusion. Is the university financially viable? Does it have a system in place to make sure that its graduates have degrees like they say they will, and so on? And everybody online here, if you're connected with a university or college in the United States or anywhere in North America, you're in an accredited institution. But then at a different level, individual programs can be accredited. Now that's not the same as departments. A lot of people are used to departments and programs being synonymous, but many departments can have multiple programs within them. And those would be specific degrees awarded with specific names. Every engineering degree is something that comes from an accredited program, except for an occasional fly-by-night outfit. And those are accredited through ABET. Now ABET these days just stands for ABET, but it used to stand for Accreditation Board for Engineering and Technology. They broadened it out, but they've kept the name. So we took a look at the types of programs that ABET accredits, and geological engineering, of course, is the one that's closest to all of the geoscience programs. There are 13 such schools, 13 schools that have such programs accredited. Some of them have more than one, say, geological engineering and geophysical engineering. So there are a few more programs, but only 13 in the country are accredited through this way with a geoscience type of program, geological engineering typically. This is the sort of thing that draws the largest negative response from geoscientists, in part because they've heard horror stories from their colleagues in the engineering college. And there is no question about it, ABET is a difficult and onerous process to go through. Any other process that we develop or do through some other organization need not be quite as onerous. And in fact, ABET doesn't need to be as onerous as it usually is. There are some evaluators that you might say are more strict or go beyond what they're expected to do in ABET, and that's where the horror stories come from. It does take a lot of work, though. So accreditation is a very formal process. The program would apply for accreditation, meet certain basic requirements, then submit a large self-study. Then typically for accreditation, every accreditation that I've heard of, whether it's forestry or business or other groups, there then is a site visit, and the site visit includes going over records and interviewing people and making sure that in fact the documentation in the self-study is valid. So that's accreditation. It is a formal process, and the program usually holds that for several years. In ABET's case, it's 6 years. Classification is something that was thought of for these purposes. It would be a process by which programs could apply and then be given a category. They would apply to a category. The category could be graduate program ready preparation, something like that, or it could be geophysics for oil and gas, or whatever. It may need not be that specific, but something that describes and defines the program and through which groups would have had the classification scheme developed. The point that's made in the next bullet item there is not evaluative, but rather exclamatory, meaning that there wouldn't be somebody coming and going over the records. It would be material that was provided by the members of the program following a procedure, a checklist perhaps, more detailed than that, of course, a lot of narrative allowed. But then that would be reviewed to see if what was declared was in fact consistent with the classification, and if so, it could be then applied. What I'm describing there is a little bit of what we might say is an active approach, where it is in fact reviewed by an external body. But there could be such a thing as a passive approach. We'll see that in a minute. Now, both accreditation and classification are focused on the department or program and not on the student or the employer. The expectation is that the students graduating from the program have met certain outcomes that are specified either through the program outcomes that would be listed or through the material identified in course syllabi, depending on how the approach for determining the program classification or accreditation is. Again, it's just on the program, not on the student or the employer. Let me follow that through for another moment. Something like ABET for engineering, if a student wants to, after graduation at some point, become a professional engineer, which of course is often the goal of many engineering students, depending on their discipline, they have to have graduated from an accredited engineering degree program. It's almost impossible to do it without having done that, without having come from an accredited program. So the accreditation becomes extremely important for engineering programs and other professional disciplines like that, business, law school, and so on, where the people that have those initials after their name mean that it has undergone significant vetting and meet standards according to certain criteria. Okay, next slide, please. Now we'll look at active classification, and this would be one where somebody evaluates the program. So there would be, like we say here, a predefined set of categories: graduate school preparation, engineering. I gave some silly examples before, like geophysics for oil and gas, but that's more specific than we would want. Some of these would be automatic. For example, if it's an engineering discipline, like geological engineering, then it's already classified by ABET, already accredited, automatic, done. Nobody needs to do any more work except perhaps to have looked on the ABET website and see that indeed it was accredited and when is the next accreditation review to take place. Another example would be state teacher licensing programs. If a educational program is identified by a state as appropriate for a licensure for teachers, then it's automatically classified as such by this other classification organization. Now, one that came up during the past year is applied sciences. I've used engineering as an example, but ABET doesn't just do engineering, as I said. One committee within ABET handles or council within ABET handles applied sciences. And most of that is things like health professionals, or firefighting, or something like that, and not really quite as professional as we might be thinking. But ABET is anxious to move in that direction, and some programs have been either considering or have undergone evaluation through the Applied Science Accreditation Council component of ABET for accreditation as an applied science program. And that may be something that's gaining some traction, although it's a little bit slow. There is a periodic review by somebody. Now that buddy, and again I'll use ABET as the example, is in fact professionals within the discipline. The ABET people like to joke that everybody imagines that there's a 60-story building in Baltimore, that's where they're headquartered, that houses the immense army of ABET professionals doing this work, and that's not true. ABET has a couple dozen employees and that's it. Everybody else is a volunteer. They volunteer through the appropriate professional societies. For example, in geological engineering, the volunteers come through SME, Society for, let me think here, Mining, Minerals, and Exploration. That's not quite right, but it's something like that, SME. I'm a member, I should know, and it's a member society of AGI. I might have gotten the title right. Anyway, the professionals, mostly academics and some industry professionals, volunteer, get trained for the review process, get trained as evaluators. I've undergone some of that training, although I am not an evaluator. I did it in order to understand what goes on there. And then they go to the sites where they review the materials that are submitted. So that active periodic review of curriculum and or outcomes. Now curriculum, of course, that's like syllabuses. Outcomes is what you claim your students will have known by the time they graduate. there's usually a review of the assessment process to determine whether or not they have actually learned that. In the case of the classification, we would then ensure that that would match one or more categories of the classification that had been set up. Now, one important thing about this is it does require money to run it. And I give the example there for how much ABET costs. It's a little hard to explain it even in 3 lines there, but it's $3,000 per institution per commission. So if it's all engineering, $3,000 per institution plus $3,000 per program. So if, like Michigan Tech, there are 10 programs, well, $33,000 during the year of the review. And that's a 6-year review process. And then in the years in between, it's $675 per program, per institution, per commission, each year in between. So the additional cost of, say, let's say your university already has 1 or more engineering programs, and you were going through the engineering review process, the incremental cost for your program would be $3,000 during a review year, plus $675 a year each year in between. If you were the first to do it through the applied science part of ABET, that would be an additional $3,000 for the review year, an additional $675 for years in between. Okay, I hope that's not more detail than you want, but the main point here is that indeed it costs a fair bit of money to run that from the evaluating organization's side. Now, within the deliberations of our committee, we were moving ahead with the anticipation that we were coming out with an active classification program that could be implemented through AGI until we started looking at the finances of it. Now, the committee didn't look at the finances of it, but AGI itself did, the office staff. And the general conclusion, without having done a survey, is that the cost would be probably too high for programs that would like to see accreditation, or sorry, an active classification process take place. This is just simply a lot of money. So next slide, please. So it's time now to start looking more at passive classification processes. The American Meteorological Society is the example I often use for that. They only have 1 category, and that is atmospheric science or meteorology. I think it can have either name. But they have certain criteria to be met. They do it through course names. Probably the next time they go through a revision of that, they would simply have subject material listed rather than a course in this and a course in that. That's a little bit over-specific. But the main point here, though, is that they list those on a website. And, of course, there's a lot of deliberation goes into this. The society, appropriate committee on the society handles that, puts it out for vetting, and it comes back, and they end up revising it every few years. But they put that on a website. And then each program that wants to can compare their program criteria with the ideal, well, with the specifications that AMS has put out. If they meet that, they can then say that they have met the AMS standards. They can't really say they're accredited by AMS. Some of them say something like that on their websites, but they can say that they have met those standards. And it's working reasonably well. I'll come back to that again at the end here. And one other thing that they've done, that AMS has done, is they've said right on the website, these are the minimum standards. However, if you want to go on to graduate school, here is what else you need. If you want to work for the federal government as a forecaster or something, you will need to pass the federal government exam, and here are the other courses you will need in order to be able to do that. And if you want to work in private industry, then you need these subjects. And they go on like that. So it's a very, very good guide for students. Every student knows to go to the AMS website. That's the professional society for that entire discipline. And they know that they can get guidance from there, and that it's well vetted and authoritative. Okay, now in our case, we would probably have to have more than one such category. We would take the sorts of versions that AMS had added parenthetically, saying if you want to do this or if you want to do that. We would make those specific categories and say these are the courses or material that would need to be covered in order to be able to say that you have this type of program. And that would be, as said in the slide here, broad, community agreed, and set of knowledge or body of knowledge for each of those things. Now that would take some effort. Other countries that have gone through this sort of process takes 2 or 3 years at least to come to consensus on those criteria. The advantages here then is that the programs and the departments that house those programs could list themselves as following the classification. If their program covered the knowledge scope, they would just have to say, yep, we did it, we covered that, this is what we have, and we meet it. Could put that on their websites. Students would know then. They could go look at that site and see, well, if I'm majoring in geological engineering, what can I do? How does that compare with geology? How does that compare with geophysics? How does that compare with other specific environmental geology? Things like that that might be available at their institution or while they're deciding among institutions, so that at least they can find a good fit, whether it's within the programs offered internally, they're already in college, or as they're trying to decide what college to go to. There are concerns over cheating. Some programs may list themselves as meeting the criteria, and then their curricula evolve and they no longer meet the criteria. From what I understand at AMS, that doesn't last very long before somebody points this out to them and politely or perhaps impolitely suggests that they either revise their curricula or take that posting down. But with 650 programs, maybe there would be cheating that would go unnoticed. I don't know. At least the criteria would be listed on the websites, and students and employers and others could make their own judgment as to whether or not the program that they are undergoing or that the student they're evaluating has undergone in fact does meet those criteria. But that's an extra level of work that many would not go to. It would be low cost to develop and to maintain. We'd have to have volunteer groups that would take care of setting up the initial guidelines for what the body of knowledge would be for the different disciplines. That will be difficult to come to because the disciplines are not discrete, well-defined entities. It's a spectrum, multi-dimensional spectrum of types of degrees that we offer. But I do think that we could come to a reasonable consensus in a lot less time than it takes the Congress of our country to do anything like that themselves. Anyway, I think we could do it without a huge problem. Maintaining it would not be too difficult. One would have to set into the process a review of it every few years, but once it's set up, the reviews are pretty straightforward. New program titles could pop up, old ones could go away, but there would have to be a process to do that. The big advantage is that then that cost is borne by some institution that has considered it to be part of its charter that this is what they do, and they make use of volunteers who consider it as part of their duties as employees of universities or whatever, that contributing to that is what they do. The programs themselves would find no expense involved with this, and that's very attractive. Now, while we were going through this process, we were realizing that more and more there were other processes coming up through other disciplines, and we found them very intriguing. Chris Keene is the expert on that, so we'll go to the next slide and I'll let Chris speak to those other processes.
Thanks, Wayne. Yeah, so one of the key things as we went through this whole exercise with the committee was to look at other STEM fields and what other parts of the geosciences might have been doing. And one of the big things that is certainly come up over the last year or two is the concept of badging, other words that are used, competencies, competency matrix, portfolios. They're all sort of variations of the same general concept. A lot of it being driven right now by funding from the MacArthur Foundation, which actually funnel money to the Mozilla Foundation, which is supporting a lot of the computer science field, coming up with a badging process. So for students as sort of an alternative to some of the accreditation classification kind of processes. What we found as we move forward, and I'll talk more about details in it, is knee-jerk reaction from most folks that we've talked to here has been, it's a very negative reaction to the terms, but really once we start talking about the concepts more broadly and explain it, it's a little less of a negative response. The biggest difference is that the focus here is actually on the students and the employers, not on the departments and the programs. Now, the departments and programs can actually leverage these kinds of approaches to their own benefit, but the burden really is not sitting on them directly. Next slide, please. So a little background about what is actually going on, some of the things that we discovered. So about 7 or 8 years ago, the U.S. Department of Labor funded most of the STEM fields except geology, to be honest with you, to come up with these competency matrices to try to understand how within a discipline, a STEM discipline / industry, an individual could sort of work their way up the chain, and what are the competencies, what are the technical competencies that they need to understand, and then eventually business and other developmental benchmarks for the, as they said, literally to work from an entry-level position to CEO. This was their concept. One of the groups that they funded was the geospatial community. We had quite a few conversations with Ann Johnson, formerly of Esri. Some of you probably know her. She was head of their higher ed program for a long, long time, and now runs an NSF-funded program, which actually is maintaining these DOL funded and support and developed competency matrix related to geospatial technologies and science. Obviously this is fed into the geography community. It's been the cornerstone now for why most geography students come out with a GIS certificate or whatever, and you see certainly very high employment rates for those folks because they're coming out with a well-documented set of skills and knowledge base. The employers understand it, the departments understand it, and basically, it's grease the proverbial skids here. The key thing, again, it's this sort of these suite of competencies you look at. It's this long laundry list, but it's sort of the suites of these things sort of represent, these bases of knowledge, so you could think of them, at various scale levels, and I think that's one of the challenges. A lot of people think, would a competency in geoscience be I can read a Brunton, or I can take a strike and dip, or is it, that they can, interpret an outcrop? I mean, there's different scales that one can work at, and that's sort of what they have already built into the geospatial component. The methodology for developing these competency matrices is pretty mature. Most of the other STEM fields have already developed these. There does appear that there might be some funding out there for our community to go out and try to do it. The funding that was put forward originally, like for geospatial, was in the order of $10 million plus to do it, because it was not just a bunch of people went into a closet and came out with a matrix, but they actually had to demonstrate that they have buy-in from the entire faculty, as well as from pretty much a demonstrable majority of the industry hiring individuals in that field. So it was a long process and certainly very comprehensive. In geoscience, though, and one that I think is most interesting, during the AGU conference, became aware of what's going on in Europe, largely driven by the energy industry, and in fact, because of some, hiccups, I would say in the employment cycles in the UK, and some, as many of you know, the big changes that happened in the UK academic, structure for geoscience programs, they look like they're going to be adopting a similar kind of competency or skill-based, set of metrics. And the biggest thing is so a couple of the major oil companies in Europe were saying, they had new employees coming in. It was hard to assess exactly what they had coming in, but the bigger problem is managing expectations. So most of the young folks coming in somehow thought that within 5 years they should be some kind of senior vice president. And they sort of had to call a timeout, and what they did is they looked at, in essence, the knowledge and that was required for each kind of position, and built out sort of this what we call a two map, which I'll be doing a presentation at AGU on, that sort of demonstrates the natural progression in a career. It takes time, and that you have to basically build up your knowledge base. And in most of these companies, they had pretty much two trajectories: one into a senior technical person, and then another into management. And they wanted to make sure that these young hires understood the trajectories, what they wanted, and then they could basically manage their own career. But they were also finding that by applying the same kind of a filter on incoming students within the departments doing, working with them to evaluate this, it helped them better match students as new employees, and helped them kickstart their careers a lot faster. So, a very interesting process, and the other big thing too was it allowed them. So, for instance, a bunch of the companies worked together, and they actually evaluated each other's internal training for these competencies. And so, as employees moved from one company to another, their knowledge base was transferred and recognized, and so they didn't have any setbacks in their career development. And as I mentioned there, this is being basically the European energy industry is definitely taking this on full force, and it's certainly going to be a force to be reckoned with for any students that have a global perspective. Next slide, please. But one of the key things is that we are getting a pushback on, certainly in North America, is the word badging or competency seem to be viewed as being very vo-tech. And the conversations that I have with some of the folks at major energy companies in Europe, they recognize that, and they recognize this was a problem in the UK, and it's sort of the Anglo interpretation of the word competency versus, as I said, maybe the Francophile concept. The European view of competency is actually about knowledge, not skills. So they would, if we wanted to go back to the idea of measuring a strike and dip with a Brunton, or interpreting an outcrop, their point would be about interpreting an outcrop, not just that very fundamental skill, because you couldn't get to that higher knowledge level and without some of those more fundamental capabilities. And the other big thing that they were focused on is that there's a key difference between competency and mastery. In fact, one of the companies, they would award their employees these competency badges, and this large portfolio that lets them manage their own career. But that's all it was. It just said that they had some kind of exposure to it. When a supervisor had actually witnessed their utilization of that competency and had successfully implemented it in real application, then the supervisor could, in essence, write a letter into personnel saying they've demonstrated mastery. So there was a way to still take it up another level. And the key point that they have here is it empowers the individual to manage their own career. They build a portfolio. So just as a designer or an artist or an architect, their career is built around their portfolio. This is what I can do. It becomes that same kind of concept without the end consumer, the employer in this case, or maybe even the potentially graduate school admission, wondering about what is exactly in that degree or in their experience base. And it does encourage the continued mobility of individuals, which the companies recognize is not something that's going to change anytime soon. Next slide, please. So I'll leave it to Wayne to discuss some of the next steps related to the committee.
Okay. Now I see that there are several members of the committee online here today, so the first statement here might be a surprise to you, and note the word likely. We're trying to guess where we're going with that. But the ad hoc committee that AGI had established is likely to release a statement of observations and not necessarily formal recommendations. I don't think we can quite herd all those cats into one corral and get them to say one meow. We've got to come out with the thoughts that we've collected, the observations we've made, and then move on from there in the sense of maybe we will make some recommendations that if we want to go this path, one path or another, then another committee gets set up to do that step or whatever. So there might be recommendations in the sense of if this becomes the goal, then do that. But based on our observations, we had wished that we had these sorts of, that we had come to a conclusion by now, and I'll readily take the blame for that. My job status changed about 3 or 4 months ago, and my daily duties became quite different from what they had been, and it's a surprise to me just how much stuff a dean has to do. I wonder if it's worth it. But anyway, that's another thought. Now, perhaps more than one of these approaches is, all of these approaches that we've talked about are valuable, and they aren't necessarily, you could only do one or the other. For example, within my own department, or the one that I chaired until a few months ago, we have geological engineering through ABET, no question about it. And then we could go through geology and applied geophysics, which are separate degree programs, through either the active, if such a thing exists, classification, or passive classification. And maybe it makes sense for us to take what, us not being just my department, but us, the academic community writ large, to take some of the approaches that industry and the Europeans are using to see if we shouldn't start applying badges or competencies to what you and I would consider to be modules within our various courses. When a student has demonstrated competency or mastered a particular ability, then they get the qualification to say they've done that in some way or another. And mechanisms are being set up for that approach to take place. So maybe there'll be a combination of these things. I do think it's important for us, though, to be able to define our geoscience programs in ways that our students understand, that their future employers understand, and so on, and that the community at large can understand. So in order to go forward from that, we need to make sure that we've actually got community interest. The interest in having somebody look at this situation and do something was very high earlier. The interest in having any action take place was diverse, and people didn't necessarily agree on what that action was. So we'll need to focus ourselves on something and see if we actually do have the community interest to move forward on that. And then if so, we'd have to find the funding to do it, because any of these steps requires some funding for at least the first step or two to get it going. Maintenance of the process may not be very expensive, but getting it going would be. Okay, I think that concludes the presentations that we've got. Chris or Heather, who is it that takes over now?
Thank you, everyone. I will be moderating some of the questions we have for the webinar today. And we actually have one kind of a discussion topic that came up. So this can go to Chris or Wayne, whoever would like to answer it. It says, here are some of the requirements for approval of bachelor's degrees programs from the American Chemical Society. And those include guidelines for faculty and staff, for infrastructure, which would include like instrumentation, computational capacity, etc., and also curriculum development and pedagogy, undergraduate research, expectations, or student skills. Do you have anything to say about some of the American Chemical Society's guidelines at all, or any comments on that?
This is Wayne. Would you like me to take that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so in fact, in longer versions, hard to imagine I have a longer version of that presentation, but I do. I'll use American Chemical Society as another example. American Meteorological Society is sort of one extreme, and ABET is sort of the other extreme, and ACS is sort of in the middle. Now, both ABET and ACS require all of those things to be evaluated. Some things that I didn't hear in there is significant support from the university administration. Basically, does the university administration think chemistry department and chemistry program is worthwhile, and they're willing to continually support maintenance and operation of it, including laboratories and so on. If they get a sense that the provost is ticked off at the chemistry department and would like to see it go away, well, then they'll use that in their report. ABET has similar things. All of those, sufficient faculty to appropriately mentor the students, laboratories that are appropriate for meeting the needs of the curriculum, and so on. The ACS has one additional aspect that's unique, though. Well, let's first another thing. The classification that we're talking about would not do any of that. Classification would not look into university support, number of faculty. It would simply look into the material that is covered by the curriculum and that students are expected to know by the time they graduate, without all that other stuff. Now, ACS, though, does have one additional aspect that is intriguing, and that is that, of course, it costs money to do that sort of review, much like ABET. So an ACS review is a little bit like an ABET review. I'm not sure the cost, but it's probably comparable or close to that. A lot of small institutions that offer chemistry degrees can't afford all of that. And they, in fact, may not be able to meet all of those additional criteria. But if they meet the curricular requirements that ACS lists as necessary for an undergraduate degree in chemistry, they can claim so on their website. They can say something like, meets ACS curricular guidelines or requirements, or whatever the exact wording is. You have to look at that a little bit carefully to realize it was not ACS accredited or reviewed. It just simply meets the curricular guidelines. So ACS is a very nice sort of middle of the road, take one approach or the other to evaluate as well. I thank the listener for having put that forward.
Great, thanks, Wayne. We have another question coming in. It asks, how did committee members feel about support on their campus administration for like this classification process? And was there a difference between like small or big departments at all?
This is Wayne. I don't think we got that sort of feedback. We got feedback about how the departments themselves felt, but whether their campus was looking at it is an interesting question. I can address one point.
Okay.
I happened to be visiting University of Connecticut, and their administration was delighted with this sort of approach. It wasn't clear to me whether they liked this approach as a way to wield a heavy hand over their department, or they don't have a department, they have a program in geoscience though, or if it was a way that the administration saw as a nice approach to giving the program the goals necessary to continue its improvement and stature. I'm not sure which. That's the only feedback I've gotten from any administration. I probably shouldn't have mentioned the university. If you can forget that, please do. But if anybody on the line is aware of their university or college's feedback to it, perhaps they could chime in here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing we did hear from a few folks with regard to formal accreditation programs was a bit of cynicism by senior administration that it doesn't matter how good your program is, the accreditation review is always going to come back, recommending more and more resources. And I think, that was a danger component that was sort of stressed a couple times, in conversations about that, where I think the classification probably would avoid that, and it's hard to judge how that would be viewed from on high.
Another question came in, and she wants to know how about the schools of geosciences? Did you talk to them? Did they have any reactions to this?
So this is Wayne again. the Jackson School of Geosciences at University of Texas at Austin. Sharon Mosier is the dean of that. And of course, she's the current president of AGI. And so she and I sat on the executive committee together, and full disclosure, we were both assistant professors together about 150 years ago at UT Austin as well. So we talked about this at some length. At first, I'm putting words in her mouth, she can correct me whenever she finds it appropriate, but at first she didn't think that this was a good idea. Why would a school like University of Texas ever need something like this? And other large programs had a similar approach. But then she began to realize that the students within those programs, in fact, did have confusion over what career opportunities, different options or tracks within that school presented for them. They didn't know whether they could get a job in this industry or that industry, or they would be ready for graduate school or what if they took one track or another. And that having something outside of the university, something that's got the credentials of a major professional society, would in fact be useful even internally in their large school. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, and I think the key point too is Sharon recognized enough that it ends up being they implemented their own system to try to accommodate this deficiency. I mean, they have the resources to do it, but I think even the discussion itself can affect change, and that's a good byproduct, I think, of these kinds of community-wide debates and discussions.
Great. Are there any other questions at all?
So there were a couple of questions on there. Yeah, that I see on the chat thing.
Here we go. Here's another question. How will this classification help promote non-traditional career paths in areas such as planning, for example, policy, law, or education and teaching? These are emerging as like major future pathways for students, and so how will this classification really help those types of students?
You gave those examples quickly. Could you say them again?
Sorry. Non-traditional career paths such as planning, policy, law, or teaching.
I wonder if we could, well, at first glance, it's not obvious that it would have. Of course, maybe this question came from Lydia Fox, but I was going to ask maybe Lydia Fox could address that, because I know that that's been one of her concerns. How can we make sure that students from liberal arts schools can recognize multiple career paths outside of the geoscience industry? And that's a very good point. We'd have to continually keep that in mind. Somebody like her would have to be reminding us of this. Of course, that question might have been exactly that reminder.
Great. Yeah, actually, Lydia, would you like to participate in this discussion? Do you have any thoughts on that? If so, you can press the raise your hand button and I will go ahead and unmute you. There we go. All right. Okay, Lydia.
I would love to comment. Unfortunately, I have to run to class, so I'm right at the end of this time. So I think that it's important that we recognize that our students they're going to a wide variety of paths, and there are a wide variety of schools, and I think that we want to make sure that we don't narrow the boxes in terms of what we're trying to prepare our students for. And I got to run, sorry.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'd like to point out, as my career keeps moving more and more in the engineering direction, it's more and more important to have voices like Lydia's heard. It's easy for somebody like me to forget that, and I appreciate the reminder.
Great, we have another question come in. Have you guys actually approached any employers regarding this idea of classification accreditation? And if so, how did they respond?
I've had some informal conversations. I've had some informal conversations regarding this, and for them, it's exactly what they want. I mean, many of the calls for accreditation have been driven out of the employer side, and it's really more about answering the question about, can I go to university X or Y and know sort of what the students are that I'm going to be getting, what their knowledge base is, versus just this is a geology degree, and then they end up looking at it and they go, yes, this is great, or wow, this is really deficient. Particularly when you start talking about the more advanced courses and the depth of mathematics and some of the other preparations. Certainly we hear out of the environmental industry a lot. Lots of kids wanting to go into environmental, but they have usually the weakest of mathematical backgrounds, and they don't have differential equations, some of the other things that they really do need to go into that industry. And so their point being is, for them, they can recruit more broadly, because right now that's a limiter. They have plenty of job openings, but they also have limited staff time that they can use for recruitment and hiring. So they just go for efficiency, and they keep going back to where they need to go. And that's probably leaving opportunities on the table for a lot of students that otherwise probably would get them.
Nice, excellent. We actually have a question from Pranoti, and she was wondering, would people like a town hall about this topic at AGU in 2014 as part of the Heads and Chairs workshop of that year? Would there be any interest in that at all? If there is interest, you can go ahead and press the raise your hand button, so that way we can kind of have an idea. We have a few up there. Okay, yeah, there would be some interest, it looks like. Another question came in, actually I guess more of an observation. For a variety of reasons, I think we need data on curriculum, on resources, faculty, etc., that we could use as a basis for comparison and evaluation. And at the most fundamental level, these data are useful for internal reviews, such as regular program reviews. So the passive classification system can actually provide such data without really imposing requirements. Do you have any thoughts on that, Wayne or Chris?
We're each hoping the other person will pick that one up. I think if we got to a point where we're starting to set up these specific classifications, we would look for such data to collect the data, compile it, make sense of it, because everybody would report it in some different way, or we just go out to websites. Most of this information is available on websites. That's pretty time-consuming and takes somebody who understands what they're reading. Does the description of some subject, quaternary geology, does that mean that's a geomorphology course or not? That sort of thing would be required, that level of judgment. But I do think it's what's necessary in order to put this together. And partly that's where the need for that sort of thing, I think, is what would help drive the possibility that funding may be available.
Mm-hmm. And one of our last questions is, how would this impact community colleges? Would it apply to those institutions as well?
I think it wouldn't be too much extra work to take the approach we've said, say the classification, and have something like that that is intended for an associate's degree. Of course, we would need community college members participating in this to those of us with doctoral granting institutions are pretty clueless there, and we need to make sure that we've got the right people involved in that engagement. But I do think it could be applied there and might strengthen community colleges' ability to team with four-year colleges and the 2+2 type of thing. That would help students in general, and certainly the way the country, most people in the country would like to see things move.
Yeah, I mean, I think adding to that is if you look at the geospatial competency matrix and that approach, that was designed to scale across all the all of the degree levels, and including even non-degree, even to the certificate level. So there are frameworks out there that show that this can be done, and I don't see any reason why a classification scheme or a badging scheme or any of those couldn't be well structured to accommodate all the communities. But I agree with Wayne. The biggest thing is we would need very active input from members of that community, because you know, we need the real and honest opinions and recommendations and participation to do anything successfully.